Animal Well is a good game is probably not a sentence you need to hear me say. Since the game released, it has seen tremendous critical acclaim and is made even more impressive by the fact that one Billy Basso is the sole developer for the title. And whilst you might look at Animal Well and think that it's a fairly cookie-cutter metroidvania, there's an element to it that I wanted to talk about. One that really makes it stand out from the crowd, and that is the subversion of Animal Well. Animal Well isn't a game that has subversive moments, it's a game that treats subversion as part of its identity. Nothing in Animal Well is as you think it is, and it uses that to build on both its gameplay and the atmosphere it creates. So let's look at that gameplay first. But before we do, if you're enjoying the content, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It does help. I know everyone says that, it's true, it really does. Maybe give it a go, I don't know. Anyway, puzzles aren't something Metroidvanias are a stranger to, but Animal Well really leans into them. And even this in itself is pretty subversive. Metroidvanias tend to be combat platformers. You start out pretty weak and defenseless, and you slowly build your arsenal of weapons and health upgrades to be able to tackle tougher foes and obstacles. Well, Animal Well doesn't really have any weapons, and as far as my playthrough went, no health upgrades either. You have these firecrackers that scare off some animals and do defeat ghosts, but they're extremely limited in both their supply and utility. Instead, most enemies and barriers in this game are not something to be defeated, but something to be solved. How do you escape? How do you get past something? How do you beat it without beating it? It's a style of gameplay that is quite foreign to the genre, and in being so, creates an atmosphere unlike any other Metroidvania that I've played. Hollow Knight feels incredibly somber. Ori feels hauntingly beautiful. Metroid itself feels quietly creepy sometimes, but Animal Well feels outright unsettling, and I think conveys the sort of vibe Metroid has tried to for years, but much more effectively. I don't think Metroid does it badly, it certainly is the series that leans into its horror sci-fi, alien-esque setting sometimes, but Animal Well is consistently unnerving, and one of the big reasons for that is this approach to game design. Never fighting, always solving. You are powerless, you are incredibly fragile, and you are reminded of this constantly. This makes even the smallest of enemies real threats, whether it's twitching whilst jumping between hedgehogs, or how weary I was of approaching bobcats for the first time because I didn't know what it would do. And that's another thing, enemy variety in Animal Well is really grounded, actually. If the name didn't give it away, this game is filled with animals. They're the primary enemy type, and this is significant because, again, it's unusual for a game like this. Metroidvanias are often filled with fantastical enemies that complement their maze-like structures. Monsters, aliens, bug-like creatures. Rarely is it just like a flamingo or a dog. And this does nothing but add to that unnerving atmosphere I mentioned before, because not all of them are enemies, and actually, it's quite frequently the cuter ones that end up being so hostile. People love dogs. Hedgehogs are cute little ball things. When was the last time you saw a scary kangaroo enemy in a game? Hell, there's a whole Twitter account dedicated to whether or not you can pet dogs in video games. The last thing I expected was for it to run after me and chew me up in its mouth. And making these animals hostile is scary because if the dog or the kangaroo is trying to kill me, then anything could. This has to be the only game I've ever played where I approached a duck with caution. You know, are the fish heads gonna hurt me? Should I be standing near these bobcats? Every first encounter is a total gamble, and that's very nerve-wracking. It also makes those moments where ghosts and other more out-there creatures appear really off-putting and surprising. Again, it subverts your expectations constantly. And whilst on the subject of enemies, let's talk about their behaviour for a moment as well. For the most part, it's pretty much what you'd expect. Hummingbirds fly around and they pop bubbles that you blow, crows hang around in murders, and hedgehogs hurt you with their spikes, and dogs run after you barking and try to play with you because you resemble a ball, I guess, but they're easily distracted by things they can fetch. Either way, every now and then Animal Well will use familiar video game mechanics to really fuck you up. For example, a lot of you will probably know that at the start of Super Mario World, there's this suspicious gap in the ground which is then followed by a bonsai bill that comes running towards you. And this usually instinctively makes the player duck and avoid the bonsai bill. This kind of setup is a gaming staple by now, right? Big dangerous thing is going to kill you, so you hide in the small gap and it won't. Easy. Well, in Animal Well, you are brought to a room with a big ostrich walking around, being all intimidating, and the ground is full of small gaps, so you know what you gotta do. So you hide in the hole and the screen goes dark due to the way Animal Well's rooms work, that being that if an area of the screen is separated by a fake wall, it will remain black instead of showing it. So anyway, you're waiting in your little hole, already kind of tense because the game has blinded your vision of the room, and you're waiting for a safe time to come out. You can hear the ostrich screeching, and suddenly this fucking head comes bending in after you, and unless you're in the very corner of that hole, it will get you. And the dogs pull this same shit later on as well. The game establishes that you can hide from dogs by going down holes, and then suddenly this one specific dog burrows in after you. It's terrifying, and it catches you completely off guard. And to explain just how effective this is at creating such an unnerving, spooky atmosphere, even with what might not seem like scary enemies, I want to reiterate how much of this comes from the context. Horror games are weird to me because I find them to be a bit of a conundrum. If I boot up a game like Resident Evil or Dead Space, I know exactly what I'm getting into. I know I'm going to see some zombies, some monsters, there's going to be a lot of blood and some jump scares. It's all very cookie cutter horror elements, and don't get me wrong, that's completely fine and very desirable in some cases. The issue is it's very easy to become desensitized to it. I talked about this briefly in our analog horror video a couple of months back, but much like movies, published horror games sort of come with an expectation where you sort them into a genre, and so even some of the worst stuff they can get away with isn't quite enough to shock or horrify the player. They just can't be that gruesome or unexpected without breaking standards. But the answer to this isn't to be extra grotesque and use disturbing themes for shock value. No, quite frankly, I think that's cheap, immature, and often kind of trivializes very real issues. I think what makes something in a game so scary isn't so much the scare itself, but the context, and Animal Well's very grounded enemy variety nails that. The Batman Arkham series does a great job of this too. Everyone knows about the excellent Scarecrow sequence where you get a fake crash and think the game deleted your save file. It's very unsettling, and quite frankly, yeah, what's scarier than having your save wiped? Especially back then, we didn't have cloud saves. And there's also Man-Bat. I normally think jump scares are just about the worst horror trope going. They're incredibly cheap and lazy because, yeah, obviously most people are going to be scared if you make a loud noise and flash a scary thing in their face. It's very artificial, and I don't feel there's no context to jump scares. But the Man-Bat jump scare I give a pass because it's so beautifully subversive. When you look at horror as a concept, the idea is to make the audience uncomfortable. They should be taken off guard, they should be on edge, and they should be feeling nervous or tense. The Man-Bat sequence does all of these brilliantly for a couple of reasons. For those who don't know, this side quest starts when you go to investigate a building where it sees Man-Bat has broken free. Having missed him, you look for clues before leaving and return back to the open world. And after a minute or so of being back in open world Gotham, Man-Bat will appear at the top of a building and jump scare the player. This is a terrifying moment because firstly, I'm playing Batman. Batman is not somewhere I expect to see a jump scare, ever really. Superhero games just don't have them. And second, it's a very open area. Jump scares are often designed to be claustrophobic, so when I'm in the very wide and vertical city of Gotham, I'm not expecting something to consume my screen like that. And third, and really the most important thing here, it's in the open world, it's outside of the mission structure. This is supposed to be a neutral zone. I have an understanding with the game at this point that scripted things like this happen when I'm in a mission, not on random rooftops whilst I'm exploring. In short, the scares are effective here because they break all the rules. It takes advantage of the fact that I'm comfortable in the open world of a superhero game and uses that to catch me off guard. The scare itself really isn't even that bad and appears on screen really slowly. It's all about the context. No one is really expecting these startling moments from a metroidvania about a blob stuck in a well full of animals. And this isn't dissimilar to the ostrich interaction I mentioned earlier. Both that and the terrifying kangaroo appear before you fairly early in the game, and it does create this constant lingering dread that any enemy you might run into is going to act in a way you don't expect them to, which again, when used in conjunction with your lack of weapons, is a very scary premise. You're unprepared and you know it. I am not joking when I say that this ostrich's fucking head contorting towards me in that hole startled me way more than any Fred Fazbear jump scare ever has, and it left a much bigger lasting impact on me as well. And Animal World's sound design doesn't help either. And by that I mean it's brilliant. The deafening silence created by the lack of music makes it especially startling when one of the many animals' Atari or Pokemon-esque cries come bellowing through your speakers, and it absolutely creates this sense of urgency. Again, it's unnatural. It's not what you expect to hear from the animals being presented because they are so grounded and real, and so it just reinforces that distressing gameplay loop. It's yet another way in which this game just subverts your expectations. And of course, when a world tries to catch you off guard and surprise you with the unexpected every step of the way, it inevitably creates an aura of mystery. Like a haunted house or an ancient temple, Animal Well is unsettlingly mysterious, and a lot of that comes from Animal Well's most subversive design feature yet, the puzzles. As I mentioned earlier, puzzles aren't all that extraordinary for a metroidvania, but they're definitely much more the focus here in absence of combat. This is mostly in the form of figuring out how to collect the game's 64 secret eggs. These are contained in cleverly hidden chests that range from something as simple as spotting a fake wall to having to figure out the right combination of items to make your way to areas that seem inaccessible. It's a giant task, but it is one that I enjoyed every minute of. However, these pale in comparison to one of the game's other collectibles, the secret bunnies. I did collect all of these, and they require the most absurd asks from the player to find. They have some of the most subversive solutions to video game puzzles I have ever seen. I'm about to spoil some solutions for them, so skip ahead to this timestamp if you'd rather not hear, but one of these bunnies has you staying AFK for 15 minutes, then having to make a very quick jump to grab it from your dream bubble. Another has you abusing the game's death mechanics to spawn behind a closed wall after hitting a switch multiple screens over, combined with some really tricky platforming. There's one that requires you find pieces of a pixel art mural on review sites of the game so you can replicate it in the game and cause a door to open. And if that seems just a bit obscure, there's also one that requires you to recognize that some grass in the background is actually a barcode and can be scanned to give you a tune to play on your flute, which in itself is pretty difficult to decode because rather than notes, it uses a number system that isn't immediately obvious to figure out. The solutions to these bunnies require you to constantly be thinking outside of the box, really far outside of it. The solutions are found by metagaming, abusing mechanics, even looking outside of the game itself. And there's actually a big question mark around this. A lot of people are questioning if this is good game design. Having secret collectibles that 99% of your player base will need a guide to find would normally be a bit of a red flag, even if they are optional extras, only required for 100%. But because of how creative the solutions in Animal Well seem to be, there's also plenty of people that think it deserves a pass. And I'm not really here to debate that today. I think that the design process is probably a video in and of itself, but one thing it absolutely does do is really sell the atmosphere, and I think it's the main contributing factor to what makes this game feel so unsettling and subversive. If the game is going to include codes and puzzles that are so cryptic, I have to look outside the boundaries of the game itself to solve them, then absolutely anything can happen. Nothing is off the table, everything you see is a potential threat, and you don't have a weapon to your name. That makes the world of Animal Well one that's as thrilling to explore as it is unnerving.